to end warfare. He's born 4 years after the death of Alexander the Great. You have 4 wars dividing the empire into the 4 winds of heaven and the 4 generals. And we know that at the time of the end is the number 4, and it's just all through this history. And Pyrrhus, only a young man of about 16 years of age when he becomes involved in this 4th Diadochi War, a young man. The first 2 wars we're not going to touch, and we won't really address the third. The first 2 wars are between dozens of generals, all fighting for a piece of that empire Alexander left. By the time you get to the third war, it's these 4 generals that have survived and carved up territory, all united as allies against one common foe, Antigonus and his son Demetrius. Antigonus was the last general who really wanted to establish Alexander's empire after the same manner. He didn't just want his share, he didn't want to necessarily just establish his own kingdom somewhere. He wanted Alexander's empire reunited under his family. So these 4 against one man who was equal in strength to all of them combined. So when we consider Pyrrhus, he comes into history in that 4th war. He had in those first 2 wars taken over huge quantities of Alexander's empire. So much so that the other 4 were so threatened. In 311 BC, it ends the 3rd Diadochi War. So in that 3rd war, as those 4 face off against him, they're unable to defeat him, but he is also unable to defeat them. So it really ends as a stalemate. And they sign a peace treaty. And that peace treaty is in 311 BC, and you have a few years of it's kind of a peace, but really both sides are rearming for war. This peace treaty is broken in 307 BC. And this begins the 4th Diadochi War. In 307 BC, it is Antigonus' son Demetrius who travels to Athens, and he conquers the city, but the city was under the control of a dictator. 10 years previously, in 317 BC, Cassander had taken over Athens and then placed a puppet ruler, a dictator in Athens. And this dictator had tired his people. So when Demetrius comes and frees Athens, the people are happy. In 317, Cassander placed a puppet dictator. In Athens. And in 307 BC, Demetrius freed Athens. But what he really did was upset Cassander, because it was Cassander's puppet ruler who had control of Athens. So here Demetrius has freed Athens, but really taken it for himself, and the Athenians were so grateful that they proclaimed Demetrius a god and started to deify him. This began the 4th Diadochi War. The other 4 generals then reunited and again took on Antigonus and Demetrius. In the middle of this war, it's in 303 BC that Pyrrhus enters the scene. In 303, He was born about 320, so he's approximately 17 years of age. And he enters the war as an ally of Demetrius. So here there is an alliance between Pyrrhus and Demetrius. Pyrrhus' sister Didymaea married Demetrius, and Pyrrhus then began to fight for Demetrius in this war as one of his generals. The Fourth Diadochi War ended in 301 BC. This is the famous Battle of Ipsus. The culmination of this whole 22 years of history was 301 BC at this battle. This battle gave us Daniel 8 and those 4 horns, where these 4 generals united finally defeat the 5th, and you have this division of the empire into just the 4. At the Battle of Ipsus, you have those 4 against Antigonus and Demetrius. What happened is they met at Ipsus. It was a location in Macedonia, near Macedonia. And you had Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus and Cassander that were all meant to face off Antigonus. They were all in union. Coming up to this battle though, to begin with, it was just Cassander against Antigonus, but Lysimachus joined him. So to begin with, it was just meant to be Cassander and Lysimachus against Antigonus. Before the battle could begin, Ptolemy received incorrect information that they had lost against Antigonus. So before he arrives at the scene of the battle, Ptolemy flees back to Egypt. He thought the battle had been fought and lost when it hadn't yet been fought at all. So he doesn't take part in this battle. What happens is just as their armies begin to face off and the battle begins, Seleucus joins them. Seleucus had been far off in the east where he had undertaken his eastern campaigns. He'd gone over to India and he'd gone into agreements there with treaties, and he had just returned from those eastern expeditions. So at the Battle of Ipsus, he just arrives just in time as the battle is starting, and he arrives with really the booty of those treaties that he made in the east. What he received from those treaties was 300 war elephants. And they are what decided the outcome of this battle, this rival of Seleucus with 300 war elephants. 300 or 400, the number does differ with the source. The day before the battle, Antigonus is 81 years of age. He knows that he might not survive this Battle of Ipsus. So what he does is the day before the battle, he names Demetrius as his successor. He knows that it's quite possible that he won't survive. So the day before, Demetrius is named who will be king in his stead if Antigonus dies. And at this battle, you have 3 allies: Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus. Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, a late arrival, versus Antigonus and Demetrius, and they are backed by Pyrrhus. So these 3 allies, known as the Allied forces versus Antigonus and Demetrius, and in this battle they are supported or backed by Pyrrhus. It was as you would, as we've already indicated, Antigonus was defeated by those elephants that Seleucus brought. Briefly before battle was joined unexpectedly, Seleucus appeared on the scene and joined Lysimachus and Cassander. This changed the entire situation. He brought a large army and 400 war elephants. Plutarch offers some numbers, but they appear to be inflated. Still, it seems reasonably certain that after Seleucus has arrived, now the armies are about equal in size. So Antigonus was so great that now that Seleucus had came, now they were equal. The battle started when Demetrius, commanding Antigonus's cavalry, attacked Seleucus' son and drove him from the battlefield. Antigonus' flank was now unprotected. And what Seleucus did was he drove his war elephants between Antigonus and Demetrius and the rest of his army. So those war elephants cut Antigonus off from his son and the majority of his army. Demetrius tried in vain to come to his father's aid, but he couldn't break through those elephants, and Antigonus was killed. Still, Antigonus attacked, expected to be saved by his son, but when Demetrius tried to return to the battlefield, he found his way blocked by Seleucus' elephants. According to Plutarch, Antigonus was killed by a hail of spears. Understanding that everything was now lost, Demetrius retreated with a small army. So you see here the war elephants of Seleucus that sway the tide of that battle and decide it in the favour of the allies. Antigonus was defeated, but this didn't end what is known as the Antigonid dynasty, because Demetrius retreated with an army. He still had his own territory and his own army, even though that his father had passed away. Demetrius was a ruler in his own, by his own authority. It's Livius that gives us the number 500 war elephants. So you can see it's known there was a great number, but not exactly how many. Pyrrhus fought bravely, but ultimately the war elephants of Seleucus won the battle. Antigonus was killed in action and his son had to flee. However, Demetrius still possessed a large navy and had garrisons in the cities of Greece. 297 BC, so again, it's about 4 years afterwards, Cassander dies. (297 BC), Cassander passed away, and Cassander was the king of Macedonia. So, if we were to draw a rough map, down here is Italy. This is Epirus, water separating the two. And this is Macedonia. It really extends down, covers, pretty much envelops Epirus. And down here is Greece, Athens, these other states, city-states. So after the death of Antigonus, Cassander took Macedonia and became king of Macedonia. So Cassander was king up here. 4 years after the Battle of Ipsus, Cassander dies. His eldest son Philip became king of Macedonia, and then his eldest son died. And this created a problem because there were two younger brothers, Antipater and Alexander. Two younger brothers to fight over their father's kingdom. Antipater was the older of these two brothers, and what he did was these two boys' mother favoured Alexander to take the throne. Because the mother favoured Alexander, Antipater had her killed, and then he chased his brother Alexander from the kingdom and took the throne. Alexander, this brother who was forced to flee, then made what we will see is a foolish decision. He asked for help to defeat his brother and take the throne of Macedonia. And he didn't ask one king, he asked two. The first person he went to was Pyrrhus. He asked Pyrrhus to help him to take the throne, defeating his older brother. But he also asked Demetrius. Demetrius had been fairly successful taking the bit of his father's empire that was left and building it. So Demetrius, by this stage, was again becoming a global player and a danger to the generals. Pyrrhus arrived first. Getting there first, Pyrrhus defeated Antipater, and he placed Alexander on the throne as Alexander had asked. For this favour, Alexander gave him some territory around Epirus. He was able to broaden his borders as a reward for helping him take the throne. And Pyrrhus went back home quite content with this addition of territory. Demetrius was a different personality. He's not spoken of well in history. He's not considered to have been someone that the historians look kindly on. And I think they have some justification for that when we look at what he did next. Demetrius was not willing to lose this opportunity to extend his territory also. So when he arrived, he realized the job had been done. What he did was stay for a while, pretend to be Alexander's friend, and then have him killed. So instead of helping Alexander, he pretended to be his friend, had him killed, and took over the whole of Macedonia. And now Demetrius again is king of Macedonia. This is where Cassander, the line of Cassander ends. So that Cassander was never able to have a successful dynasty, so to speak, like the others. His sons fought it out, and in the end, Demetrius, killing the youngest, took over his empire. This action of Demetrius put a serious strain on his relationship with Epirus. They were friends and in union back in 303. That alliance still stood. But this behaviour by Demetrius in killing Alexander, taking over Macedonia, put a strain on their relationship. And also now Pyrrhus finds Demetrius as his neighbour, a powerful and dangerous neighbour, and one he didn't want so close to his borders. Not only that, but Pyrrhus' sister, who had married Demetrius, died about this time. So they also, again, that alliance was being severed. Around 291 BC, this all occurred between the Battle of 301 and 291, so in that 10-year history. 291 BC, their relationship has gotten so bad that now they are becoming enemies. In 291 BC, Demetrius is down here in Greece. He's known as the besieger. His favourite way to fight a war was by besieging cities. And he would build huge weapons of war, huge siege weapons, which would take 400 people to wield battering rams. Battering rams so large you would need 400 men to drive them into the walls. Huge siege weapons. So he's known as Demetrius the Besieger. And in 292, 291 BC, he is down here in the south of Greece, besieging a city. He ruled by now Macedonia and much of Greece. He'd built an empire that was beginning to rival what his fathers had had. And Pyrrhus sees an opportunity to not necessarily fight him or go to war with him, but to make trouble. Demetrius is down here in the south of Greece besieging a city. We understand that he's also king of Macedonia. So just to be annoying, Pyrrhus decides that it's a good idea to invade in here, into the area known as Thessaly. This is a diversionary campaign. He knows that Demetrius is trying to take this city, so what he's doing is upsetting his attempts on the south by distracting him and invading him, really cutting his empire in half. So Pyrrhus drives into Thessaly. Demetrius is able to expel him, so there is very little known about this except Pyrrhus invaded Thessaly. Seeing Demetrius coming, he fled back to his own country. But this was the first sign of open warfare between these two former allies. 291, Pyrrhus invades Thessaly, really driving through the heart of Demetrius's empire. Demetrius goes back down to this city he was besieging, finishes that successfully, takes the city, and he's bitter against his former ally for invading him. Now he has time for revenge. This occurred in 289-288 BC, a couple of years later. Finishing this siege down in Greece, Demetrius takes his army and he marches right through the center of Epirus and he just ravages the country. In 289, Demetrius deliberately led his troops on a campaign against Epirus, ravaging the region. The text that they're quoting from, the historical text, suggests that Demetrius' motive was caprice. He needed to occupy his army and at the same time provide for them loot, but the picture is more complex than that. This was retaliation for Pyrrhus' invasion of Thessaly. And the city he was at that stage besieging was the city of Thebes. So in 291, he had chased Pyrrhus back. In 289, he invaded and ravaged Epirus, while Pyrrhus was preoccupied. What happened was Demetrius marching up and into Epirus. Pyrrhus tried to meet him, but their armies missed each other. So Demetrius comes up into Epirus, and Pyrrhus, right when Demetrius is ravaging his country, finds himself outside of his own borders and over in this area, of no use to his own people. And down here, Pyrrhus does fight a battle with one of the generals of Demetrius. But in this invasion and ravaging of Epirus, the two armies never meet. They never actually fight. Pyrrhus never is able to defend his country. Pyrrhus does try to drive into Upper Macedonia and take Demetrius on there when Demetrius was seriously ill. But Demetrius rose from his sick bed and Pyrrhus fled back to Epirus. Pyrrhus was forced to come to an agreement by this stage with Demetrius. By this stage, 289-288 BC, Demetrius retaliated for 291 and invaded and ravaged Epirus. The two armies passed each other. Pyrrhus found himself down in this territory, and he met a general of Demetrius, and they fought Their armies didn't actually fight in this battle that occurred in this time period. Instead, Pyrrhus, as a good follower of Alexander the Great, who lived for war, said to this general, "How about you and I fight and our armies stand back and watch?" So it was hand-to-hand combat between this general of Demetrius and Pyrrhus himself. And Pyrrhus in this combat, one-on-one combat, defeated and nearly killed the general of Demetrius. So the armies do not go to war, but the generals do, and Pyrrhus is victorious. So at the same time his country is ravaged, you also see Pyrrhus defeat a general. Demetrius was willing to come to an agreement with Pyrrhus, some type of peace treaty in this history, because he had something else to occupy him. He was busy building one of the largest armies, the largest, military preparation that the world up to this stage, one of the largest that they'd ever seen. He built a fleet of about 500 warships, amassed a coalition army of 100,000 strong. Between 289, 288 and 287, we can place a huge military build-up by Demetrius. His empire already extends through Greece and Macedonia and is beginning to rival that of his father's. And now with this massive military build-up, you can imagine that these original generals are a little nervous. They remember the trouble they had with his father, how hard it was to defeat his father, and seeing this son begin to rival and repeat the behaviour of his father. Our three remaining generals, Cassander had died, Lysimachus, Seleucus and Ptolemy, decide it's time for action. They need to defeat Demetrius before he gets any stronger. So what they do is they send an ambassador to Pyrrhus and ask him to break his original treaty with Demetrius and join them in taking down Demetrius. It was at the apex of power and success that Demetrius lost his kingship. Demetrius had, as we said, been building a massive army, 12,000 cavalry, 500 ships. This vast military and naval program is reflected in the coinage of the time. They can go back and look at the coins that were being minted by him in Macedonia at that time, and it gives some indication of the military program he was building up. Sometime then, in around that 288 time period, Seleucus, Ptolemy and Lysimachus again come into an alliance to defeat him, and they send a joint embassy. All these three generals send a joint embassy to Pyrrhus, urging him to ignore his previous treaty with Demetrius and join them in an attack on Macedonia. Pyrrhus agrees. He agrees to turn on his former ally. And so in 287 BC, Pyrrhus leaves his country of Epirus and he marches on Demetrius. He marches from the west. Seleucus and Ptolemy, while they were part of this alliance, they never actually turn up for the battle. It's only Lysimachus that joins Pyrrhus in this attempt to defeat Demetrius. Pyrrhus marches from the west and Lysimachus from the east. So you have a two-front war. Demetrius is facing Lysimachus on the east and Pyrrhus on the west. As we indicated before, Demetrius wasn't the nicest man, and he, unfortunately for him, didn't only treat his enemies badly, he also was not a very popular king with his own people or with his own army. So what happened when his army saw Pyrrhus come from the west and Lysimachus from the east, they were not willing any longer to defend him. So it doesn't matter how big your army is, if it's 100,000 strong and you have 500 ships, if your people aren't willing to defend you, if they just don't like you, if they're not going to fight for you, doesn't matter how strong you are, at that point you have nothing. Pyrrhus was the direct opposite. He was loved by his army and by his people. So many of these soldiers of Demetrius, when they see Pyrrhus come from the west, they abandon Demetrius and join Pyrrhus's forces. So just like we saw in 291 and in 289, 288, again there is no battle. They do not fight. Demetrius' own people turn on him. And when they turn on him and join Pyrrhus, some join Lysimachus. He flees. That's the end of Demetrius and the end of the Antigone dynasty. And Macedonia is divided into east and west by Pyrrhus and Lysimachus. So in 287, Pyrrhus joins what are known as the Allies. And Demetrius is defeated by a coalition of Pyrrhus and Lysimachus. And what you then see is a division into east and west. So the kingdom is divided between Pyrrhus and Lysimachus, and this creates a whole new conflict. Lysimachus in particular is not happy with just having the east. He wants all of it. Again, Pyrrhus has his territory in the west, but it's Lysimachus who is antagonistic towards Pyrrhus. Again, they never fight. Lysimachus wants the whole of Macedonia, but instead of going to war with Pyrrhus, he chooses a different mode of warfare. And that is, as I will describe, as A.T. Jones described for us. Lysimachus soon succeeded in sowing such distrust among the soldiers who had lately gone over from Demetrius to Pyrrhus, that they now went over from Pyrrhus to Lysimachus. So what Lysimachus did was sow distrust in the soldiers of Demetrius that had sided with Pyrrhus. How he was able to sow that distrust was by one of the ways was by suggesting, really ridiculing why they would let a king of Epirus rule over them. It had always been the king of Macedonia who was stronger and therefore ruling over or having some control over Epirus. And now you have the king of this tiny little country down here ruling over the people of Macedonia. So Lysimachus says, why are you letting this king rule over such a wonderful empire as Macedonia? So, at the risk of bringing it in too early, this is information war. And this is what gets Lysimachus the whole of this territory, is he actually turns his own people against Pyrrhus. This so weakened Pyrrhus according to A.T. Jones, that rather than to contend against the power of Lysimachus, he, with his own Epirotes and original allies, returned to his own country of Epirus. This left the whole of Macedonia to Lysimachus, who formally took possession of it and added it to his dominions. Lysimachus followed up another description of this history. What he conducted, according to a history of Macedonia, page 235, was a propaganda campaign among the leading Macedonians. He played into their nationalistic feelings of superiority. And he used their nationalistic feelings to turn them against Pyrrhus. I would describe this 287 to 285 BC as a Cold War. And it's in this history that Lysimachus used, you could say, subterfuge. Propaganda campaigns, same thing. What he also did was cut Pyrrhus off from his supplies, so he sent men in here to cut his trade routes off. You could call that sanctions. Stemming the flow of money and supplies. And this ended in 285 BC when Pyrrhus gave up all of this territory, returned to the kingdom of Epirus, and again he's restricted to the borders of his own original country. He's lost everything else. We suggested this morning that Pyrrhus's life comes into two parts. First, you have his campaigns in Macedonia. Second, in Italy. It's this campaign in Macedonia that we've followed. In 285 BC, that campaign ends, and that's the end of his attempt to gain control of this region, restricted to the borders of his own country. BC, though, takes us to a separate scene of war. Again, to remind us about what was happening in Italy at this period of time. This is where our history switches from Macedonia and Greece to Italy. In 285 BC, this same year that Pyrrhus loses control of Macedonia, things are heating up in Italy. Around the time of 280, 281, back into this history, you find Rome taking over the north of Italy. It has this region up top. They've defeated any competition for control of the north of Italy. And down in southern Italy, all these independent Greek city-states. Many of these city-states have a problem. They're divided internally into two factions, known as the aristocrats and the democrats. Around that time, that period of time, 285 BC, these two factions in one particular town are fighting it out, and that city is the city of Thurii. Here you have the aristocrats and the Democrats, both striving for control of Thurii. Tarentum, on the east coast of the Bay of Taranto, has a sphere of influence, or what they consider hegemony, over the south of Italy and over these other independent city-states. The aristocrats and Democrats, really what divided these two was over where their alliance lay. The aristocrats were driven by money and trade. So to promote their wealth, to promote their trade, they weren't that nationalistic. They wanted to break free from this control of Tarentum and ally with Rome. The Democrats were more patriotic. They wanted to stay with their Greek brethren and stay under the influence of Tarentum. Really, it's a struggle of which dictator you want to choose. Do you want to come under the authority of Tarentum, or do you want to come under the authority of Rome? The aristocrats are driven by their trade and their wealth to want to ally with Rome. The Democrats want to stay with their Greek brethren and stay under the authority of Tarentum. Around this period of time, the aristocrats win. And when Thurii is threatened by some of the barbarian hordes that are still attacking these city-states in the south, the aristocrats now in control of Thurii appeal to Rome for protection. They first appeal for Rome's protection in 285 BC. Over in Macedonia, Pyrrhus lost all but Epirus itself. But then we also see over in Italy, it's in 285 that you begin to see this conflict between north and south. It's here that Thurii appeals to the protection of Rome. Thurii's appeal to the barbarian city on the Tiber River, they're referring to Rome, is a clear indication that Rome had now emerged as the acknowledged hegemonic power over all of Italy, and that Romans could now be counted on to provide security against external attacks. Rome accepted Thurii's plea for assistance. So Rome particularly wanted Thurii, not only because now they can start to drive into the south, but it's also a position of power within this Gulf of Taranto. The consul Fabricius led an army against the enemies of Thurii and defeated them in battle, and he left a garrison in Thurii. This was in 282 BC. So Thurii actually appealed to Rome for protection twice. They appealed to them in 285, and then they appealed again in 282. And it's in 282 that Rome responds and places a garrison in Thurii. This is where our scene changes. So in 282, Rome aids Thurii, but this angers Tarentum. See, Rome, going back a few decades, had made a treaty with Tarentum that Rome would never sail ships into this Gulf of Taranto. Rome had promised Tarentum they would not come into what Tarentum considered their sphere of influence. So when Rome comes down and places a garrison in Thurii and defeats their enemies, they sail warships into this Gulf of Taranto. And this angers Tarentum, it breaks their old treaty. Tarentum attacks that fleet of 10 warships. They capture one, sink 4, and the other 5 escape. Tarentum then invades Thurii. They attack their neighbour and expel the Roman garrison and force Thurii back under their control. So Tarentum attacks Thurii and forces it back under the control of Tarentum. This causes Rome to declare war on Tarentum. And Tarentum realizes that they are not strong enough to wage war against Rome. So what they do shortly after is they send ambassadors over to a Greek neighbor, a Greek relative really, Pyrrhus, and ask him to please come and aid them, take over this war effort against Rome. As we looked at before, Pyrrhus is now largely unoccupied. He's somebody that was born and has lived to wage war. And now he finds himself sitting back in Epirus, having lost all of Macedonia to Lysimachus, with nothing to do and no idea where to go next to establish his empire. So Pyrrhus readily agrees. And in 280 he arrives on the shores of Italy. In 280, Pyrrhus arrives. In Tarentum. The Tarentines, people of Tarentum, sent over ships to transport to Italy Pyrrhus and the army he would take with him, 25,000 men. On account of the violent storm, he was driven to the coast of the Messapians, a bit of a distance from Tarentum, where he was obliged to land. The story is told that in the middle of the storm, afraid of shipwreck, he dove from his own ship and swam to the shore. History paints him as quite the hero. He immediately begins preparing Tarentum for war. He forces them to stop, he shuts their baths, all their places of entertainment and relaxation, and begins to prepare the city for war. He hasn't finished that preparation. The rest of his army that were driven by that storm to a distance from Tarentum have not yet joined him. When he hears word that Rome is marching south, he does not yet want to fight. So Pyrrhus sent a herald to ask the Romans whether or not he could, instead of fighting them, become some type of mediator between them and Tarentum. Rome replied, "The Romans neither take Pyrrhus as an arbiter or a go-between, nor fear him as an enemy, and Pyrrhus is forced to meet them in battle." This first battle was later in the same year he arrived, 280 BC. It's the first of 3 battles he fights against Rome, and this is the Battle of Heraclea. The first of these battles. In 280 BC, he's known as the Eagle of Tarentum. His own soldiers gave him that name, the Eagle. He landed in Tarentum with 20 war elephants, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 archers, 20,000 soldiers, etc., and engaged the Romans in this first battle at Heraclea. In this first battle, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans between the cities of Heraclea and Pandosia. That's why it's known as the Battle of Heraclea. Heraclea was a city not far distant, a town not far distant. This was a small battle about half the size of the ones following, and Pyrrhus was victorious. Why did Pyrrhus win? Elephants. The Romans up to this time, as we've been describing, hadn't become heavily involved in world politics. They'd still stuck to northern Italy, essentially, and their soldiers had never before seen an elephant. So when they come down and march on Pyrrhus, and they send him this tough message, we don't fear you as an enemy, but when they face him in battle, they're coming against 20 war elephants, and never having seen anything larger coming at them than a horse. When they're in battle and there's 20 elephants with riders charging them, their soldiers are terrified. And this is really what wins Pyrrhus victory in this first battle at Heraclea. But to build the empire they did, Rome is a fairly stubborn power. They went away from that battle and decided that not willing to concede defeat. Pyrrhus, after Heraclea, when he defeats them at Heraclea, not sure of the exact location, I think it was somewhere up there, where he met them, he marches on Rome. He gets fairly close to the city, but he isn't able to engage because winter is coming. We're going to have to squish up this board a little. I've given myself too much space. So in the rest of our studies this morning, I'm just going to make it fit down here. And then for tomorrow morning, we'll rewrite it and then step through it slowly so we can repeat it. I'm sorry, it's gotten so tight at the end. But this first battle of Heraclea, just leading into winter, they're not able to continue their fight. So the next battle occurs the following spring in 279 BC. This is known as the Battle of Asculum. It has a couple of different spellings if you research it and it confuses you. Asculum or Osculum. During this winter period, Rome is trying to think how they can counter the effect of the elephants. How can they make sure that Pyrrhus doesn't win again with this mode of warfare that they have never seen before? So what they do is they build 300 anti-elephant carts. Over the winter, Rome is very busy constructing these carts. Really, they're just wooden carts with people on them with some type of flamethrowers. The carts have spikes out the side to try and pierce the elephants. Anything they can try and put on a cart that looks like it can take down an elephant. And they build 300 of these and wheel them to the town of Asculum to next face Pyrrhus. This second battle is twice the size of the Battle of Heraclea before it. It occurs over 2 days. The first day was not decisive, so they withdraw and they come against again. In 279 BC, Pyrrhus fought the second major battle of the war at Osculum. This one was of a much greater scale, taking 2 days in the hills of Apulia. The Roman general Publius Mus managed to use the terrain to reduce the effectiveness of Pyrrhus's war elephants. Because of this use of the mountainous terrain, day number 1 ended with a stalemate. The second day, Pyrrhus made another attack with war elephants supported by his infantry and overwhelmed the Roman position. Again, Pyrrhus is victorious. And what wins him the victory again is his war elephants. Quoting from the author Jacob Abbott, Pyrrhus, Makers of History, he says the Romans first encountered the elephant in 280 BC. Pyrrhus had transported 20 of the beasts to Italy by ship, and at the Battle of Heraclea, the unfamiliar animals routed the Roman cavalry. Their horses, before they got near the animals, were terrified and ran away with their riders. The next year at Osculum, there was another Pyrrhic victory. The greatest havoc was wrought by the furious strength of the elephants, since the valour of the Romans was of no avail in fighting them, but they felt that they must yield before them as before an onrushing billow or a crashing earthquake, and not stand their ground, only to die in vain or suffer all that is most grievous without doing any good at all. So the Romans pretty much fled. The Romans stood most in awe of the elephants, and they resorted to some peculiar and extraordinary means of resisting them. They had, for this battle of Asculum, prepared a great number of chariots, each of which was armed with a long-pointed spear projecting forward, in such a manner that when the chariots should be driven towards the elephants, they might pierce the bodies of the beasts and destroy them. The chariots too were filled with men who were all provided with firebrands, which they were to throw at the elephants to frighten them. These chariots were carefully posted in front of the part of Pyrrhus's army where the elephants were stationed, and the charioteers were strictly ordered not to move until they should see the elephants advancing. But these carts were not successful, and they were just broken apart by the elephants. You may have heard the term used, a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory is a term that really was coined out of the Pyrrhic War, and it's used to describe a victory that is not really a victory at all. You see, in this war effort, Pyrrhus has sailed his men over from Epirus to Tarentum, and in these two battles, while he does defeat Rome, he suffers nearly as many casualties. And Rome, being on their homeland, is so easily able to replenish the troops that they lost. So if 15,000 Roman soldiers die, the Romans, being willing to fight war and having their own people, so many of their own people close by, those ranks quickly filled up again. But if Pyrrhus down here, far from his own country, loses 15,000 men, he can't so easily replace them. And he realizes that if he's to fight Rome again, in losing so many men, he will be so weakened that even another victory may see his defeat. Even if he defeats Rome again at another battle, he may lose so many men that he's too weakened to continue the war. So he goes into an armistice with Rome. Into a peace treaty, a temporary peace treaty, and not a very strong one. Rome was quite willing to continue fighting, so they sign a very tentative armistice that they will take a break in this war. He then hears word that down here in Sicily, there is trouble. Terrible Sicily, not trouble. Down here in the island of Sicily, there is a separate problem, unrelated to what's going up on here. Sicily is under the control of a dictatorship, foreign dictatorship. Jacob Abbott continues to speak of this history. While Pyrrhus is concerned about the loss of men in these battles, something new information comes to him. The men of Sicily send ambassadors to Pyrrhus and beg him to leave Italy and come down and free them from the Carthaginians. Down here you have Carthage, up the north of Africa. And Carthage had taken over Sicily and were fairly brutal dictators to the island of Sicily. So the people of Sicily asked Pyrrhus to leave off from this war in Italy and come and free them from Carthage. Pyrrhus happily agrees. He starts to develop this war plan. Still with this same mindset as Alexander the Great, what he hopes to do is sail down to Sicily and take Sicily. And then with this island location, he can build a massive navy. If he builds a massive navy in Sicily, he can come down and defeat Carthage itself. And then if you defeat Carthage, you can build a bigger navy. And then you can sail up under here, under Greece, and you can take Greece. If you take Greece, you can take Macedonia, then you can come back down and take Italy. So his plans are only getting bigger and bigger and more grand. He's not just leaving off from this war, he has a plan now. Okay, I'll take Sicily, but I'm really going to just continue to build and build and build a bigger army, a bigger navy, and just take everything. So he quickly frees Sicily from Carthage. The Carthaginians are driven from the island, all except one city up in here that Carthage, they hold out against a siege. The Carthaginians ask him to just leave them that city, just give us one place in Sicily and we'll leave off from the rest. But he isn't willing. And this is where we start to see a change in Pyrrhus, from who is normally painted as a fairly loved by his people, fairly reasonable. Now we start to see a different aspect of his character really become more obvious. In trying to build up this navy, he then turns into the next dictator of Sicily. Sicily thought they were being freed from a dictatorship, but they soon find that Pyrrhus is a worse dictator than Carthage ever was. What he begins to do is kill the chief men of the island, imprison others. He establishes his own friends and allies into positions of power in the city, and then he starts to enforce conscription. So he forces the people of Sicily to begin building this massive navy, to start building his war effort. And the more that they oppose to do that, the more of a dictator he becomes. In the midst of him forcing this dictatorship on the people, he starts to run out of money. And when he begins to run out of money, he does something that he later blames for all of his future failures. What he does to top up his bank is he raids a temple. There was the temple of Persephone on the island, a goddess of the people of Sicily. And this temple had underneath it immense amounts of gold and treasures that had been dedicated to this goddess. And what he does is he raids that temple and takes all of that wealth, all of those riches and treasures. He puts them on ships and attempts to sail them back to Tarentum to fund his war effort. He had left his son in Tarentum, so he still has control of the city, and he tries to send all these treasures back to his son. His excuse for becoming such a dictator really was this idea that he needed to protect them from Carthage. So it was under the excuse of fighting the Carthaginians that he was able to take this power. We also see a temple desecration, albeit a pagan one. So a pagan temple desecrated. Unfortunately for him, Those ships taking this immense amount of wealth hit a storm and they're all wrecked. All of that treasure is lost at sea and then washes up on the shores of Lopri. So it actually has no benefit from raiding that temple. Seeing these ships wrecked scares him. He is a pagan king and he understands that he desecrated the temple of a goddess. So how he interprets that is as a warning of judgment, that he has desecrated this temple and this is the retaliation of the goddess. So in fear, he gathers up all the treasures that washed up on the beaches and he places them back in the temple. So he doesn't gain anything by desecrating this temple. And later on, when he suffers defeat after defeat, he blames all that future loss on the raiding of this temple, on the fact that he upset who they saw as their pagan gods. Around this time, the people of Sicily become tired of his dictatorial behaviour, and they decide that they would rather their old masters than their new ones. And what they do is they sail over to Carthage and say, please come back. A terrible hatred arose against him in the cities of Sicily. Some of those cities joined the Carthaginians. Seeing now that he was losing his control over Sicily and would no longer be able to hold it, at this same time he hears word that Rome is marching on Tarentum again, and he leaves from Sicily and sails back to Tarentum to face Rome again. He leaves just in time. As he's sailing away from Sicily, Carthage attacks his fleet and he only just makes it out of Sicily. He meets Rome in battle again one last time. We'll just place these battles down here and then tie them back to this line tomorrow morning. He faces Rome again in 275 BC. And this is the Battle of Beneventum. It's his final battle with Rome. He marches back to Tarentum and he finds that many of his former allies, these city-states that had joined him, are no longer willing to fight beside him. They've seen him abandon them and go over to Sicily, and then his behaviour there. So when he comes to fight Rome again, many of his allies have abandoned him. In this final battle with Rome, Pyrrhus is defeated. And this is what we already suggested as the Battle of Panium. This is the defeat of the King of the South. What happened in this battle? Pyrrhus faced off against Rome. And marching in front of him, in front of his army, were his 20 war elephants. What had won the battle for him in those two previous encounters. So these elephants marching in front of his army, charging Rome. There's not a consistent account of exactly why it occurred, but what we know happened was at some stage in this battle, these elephants, for one reason or another, turned back towards Pyrrhus, and running out of control of their handlers, ran over Pyrrhus's own army. So in this battle, he's defeated. Again, the elephants decide the outcome of the battle, but he's defeated by his own elephants. What it's believed has happened is one of these elephants was a calf, and it was wounded, and it cries out And it's believed that his mother was one of the 20 elephants, and hearing the cries of her young, she turns these other elephants around, and in their madness to get to this calf, they run back over their own army. This devastates Pyrrhus, and gathering the men he can, he flees back to Tarentum, gets on a ship and sails back to Epirus. He is done with Italy. It's interesting to note the name of Beneventum. We understand here, as I've already suggested, this is Panium. And we make much of the name Panium because of the word Pan, Pandora's box. Beneventum is known as the Italian Salem. It's pretty much was the center of witchcraft for Italy. It's known as the city of witches. It sits at the fork of the Appian Way where two rivers meet. These two rivers, the Sabato and the Color. It is believed that witches from all over the world would gather at the town of Beneventum. The Emperor Domitian later established a temple of Isis here, the god that controls serpents. This then, combined with tree worship that was brought by the Lombards later on, all merged itself into a cult centered in Beneventum, the cult that worshipped the serpent in the tree. This also combined the worship of the goat god. It's said that all the witches of the world would gather at Benevento to worship this tree serpent in a gathering known as the Tragenda. The Tragenda means the 300. This is a counterfeit 300. They would chant the call, "Ungent, ungent, carry me to the walnut tree of Benevento, above the water and above the wind and above all other bad weather." And it is suggested that one of their rites was their custom to meet on a Saturday night around the walnut tree to give birth to the Sunday Sabbath. This, we've suggested, is Panium, which is the midnight cry, and the beginning of that of the Sunday law. This takes us back to where we began. As we read from A.T. Jones, at the beginning, the reputation of the Romans beginning now to spread through foreign nations by the war they had maintained for 6 years against Pyrrhus, whom at length they compelled to retire from Italy and return ignominiously to Epirus. Ptolemy Philadelphus sent ambassadors to desire their friendship, and the Romans were charmed to find it solicited by so great a king. The world now knew that Rome was a superpower in the making, and the Egyptian king Ptolemy II Philadelphus was willing to conclude a treaty of friendship. So what they recognized in 275 BC, the rest of the world stands up and takes notice that Rome has just defeated Pyrrhus. See, Ptolemy was well acquainted with Pyrrhus. Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Seleucus, they all knew Pyrrhus from back in his history, and they knew that he was a strong general that rivaled Alexander the Great. So when Rome refuses to concede defeat and continues to war with him and then defeat him, Ptolemy recognizes the feat that was. And he desires to know who Livius described as a superpower in the making. So 273 BC, Egypt, Ptolemy, you could say the world or the United Nations, sends ambassadors to create this alliance of friendship with Rome. Back in this history, we know it's the armies of Rome, which would be representative of the United States. But in here, we see diplomatically, this is a notice of what the role Rome has played in this affairs. And I would suggest that this includes, a main component is the role of the papacy in this history. We understand that both the United States and the papacy can be symbolized as the King of the North. This takes us back to where we started, and the catalyst that convinced Egypt to initiate contact with Rome. Rome's defeat of Pyrrhus was a clear declaration to the rest of the ancient Mediterranean world that the Romans had arrived on the world scene of warfare and power politics. They recognized that fact in 273 BC. And in 272 BC, Rome sends ambassadors back to Egypt. Fabius, Maximus Georgius, the maximum flood. It's also interesting to trace the history between 275 and 272 BC. See, at 275 BC, Pyrrhus is defeated, the south is defeated, but Tarentum has not yet surrendered, and Pyrrhus is still alive. In 272 BC, we see both of those things occur. In 272 BC, Tarentum has not yet surrendered. They're holding out under siege. From 275 to 272, Rome besieged Tarentum, but the city was still not fully surrendered, even though the world recognized that the south had been conquered. So in 272 BC, Tarentum surrenders and it falls. Now you have the complete fall of Tarentum, the king of the south. It's progressive through this history from 275 to 272. We're going to mark three events in 272. First of all was this delegation, symbolic of the maximum flood. The second of all, the completing of the fall of Tarentum. And the third I want to mark is the death of Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was 46 years old. He had gone over down into Greece, and he was engaging in a battle down in Greece, in the city of Argos. In those battles down in Greece, he loses his son. His son is killed in battle, and this is really what he's not thinking clearly. He's just lost his heir, his son, and he makes some foolish decisions in the next battle, and he engages in the town of Argos. A battle that was meant to take over this town goes wrong, and he finds himself fighting with his army, fighting within the walls of Argos. And now you can imagine a battle fought in the back streets and the alleyways between foes you can't see. He's lost contact with his army, and it's turned onto one-on-one combat. This was not the way the battle was meant to be fought. So in the back streets of Argos, down an alleyway, he's fighting in one-on-one combat with a soldier. It's believed it was the mother of this soldier that he was engaging with, watching her son fight the famous King Pyrrhus down below her. She's watching from a top window, so she begins to throw tiles down onto Pyrrhus. One of these tiles she throws hits him in the head, and he falls off his horse, stunned, and her son kills him, cuts off his head. So Pyrrhus is killed at 46 years of age. This is the city of Argos where he is killed. Argos means glistening, bright, white. The reason its name is given the name Argos of this bright white is because in the plains below Argos they would grow their wheat, grow their grain. And it's believed that the name was linked with the visual impression given by the plain of Argos during the time of harvest. So this again is connected with harvest. We connected harvest at that same place when we looked at that first line of Acts 27, the harvest of the world after Sunday law. Theodore Mommsen in the History of Rome says in 272 BC, For the first time, Italy was now united into one state under the sovereignty of the Roman community. This was the final end result of the Pyrrhic War. We can see that the defeat of the King of the South in 275 is a point in time, but it's also progressive. The final end of the King of the South, that death blow, is really in 272. And we're going to consider that and all of these things tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, prior to starting, I'll try and redraw this so it isn't so messy and divided. And then we're going to just quickly step through this history again before we start making some applications. The final thing I want to remind us of, what we've looked at today, is the life of Pyrrhus, the life of the King of the South from the beginning of his involvement in world affairs, because we can see that it takes part in two histories. First in Macedonia with Pyrrhus allied with Demetrius and then against Demetrius, resulting in a Cold War, and then the scene changes and it's Pyrrhus against Rome. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that you do not leave us in ignorance. Father, we know the world is stirred with the spirit of war. Many people have questions, Lord. Many people out in the world wonder what is going on. Many Christians, Lord, people who love you in different churches who have not yet learnt of your truth, Father, are wondering what's going on. I pray that you'll prepare us with the correct information, with the correct prophetic message, to be able to show them, give them some understanding of what is occurring in the world around them. And I pray you also prepare us in heart to reflect your character, that our work for them might be with success. Thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings and for the day that we've shared together. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.